Hi gang, Rob here. It is 18 February 2013 and I'm coming to you tonight with another knife review, and this one's going to be an interesting one. I may have to talk kind of fast. The knife we're going to be talking about this evening is the almost excellent Spyderco Manix 2 XL. This is a knife that I sort of thought long and hard before purchasing. I had handled a friend of mine's Manix 2, the normal original length Manix 2, constructed with 154 cm steel hollow ground, and I didn't really like it, frankly. I thought it was too chunky for the blade length. I thought the grind was kind of abrupt. I didn't think it felt very good in hand, and I thought the proportions were kind of off. And when the Manix 2 XL came out, I thought, well, you know what? Maybe with a nearly 4-inch blade, the rest of the proportions of the knife would work. And frankly, they do. And let's kind of get into dimensions here and some engineering specs on the blade before I get into the rather complicated review. This knife has Spyderco's very popular, very common leaf-shaped blade. It is 3.88 inches in length. The length of the handle is 5.08 inches, which gives you an overall length in the neighborhood of 8.96 inches. The knife is constructed using S30V blade steel. It is built in Golden, Colorado, USA earth. Let's see if I can give you the markings on the blade. Come on, camera. There you go. And if you notice, the designer's mark is that of Eric Glesser. Okay, now how's this thing put together? It uses Spyderco's patented ball bearing lock, which is very similar in operation to Benchmade's Axis lock. Similar in operation, not very similar in execution. Instead of using a bar that crosses the blade tang, moved by 2 omega springs, Spyderco uses a ball bearing which engages the blade tang, enclosed in a polymer cage. Some earlier versions had sort of a translucent cage. This one has the later black cage. And then it's actuated using a coil spring. A little stronger, perhaps more durable than the Omega springs in the Benchmade. And in the field, if it breaks, theoretically you can use the spring from a ballpoint pen to replace it. In actuation, I guess I would say it's a little more difficult to get good at than the Axis lock, especially when new. The cage ball lock prefers to be actuated with a pinch from your thumb and index finger. As you wear it in, it can be done from one side with just the thumb. This knife also uses Spyderco's rather new bushing pivot system, where theoretically the pivot can be cranked down to full tightness and the blade will be at a specified tolerance or tension, meaning you don't have to adjust the pivot for perfect blade pivot action. Supposedly that's controlled by dimension. Later in the review I'll explain how it just isn't done very well. The knife has medium texture G10 scales, a 4-way positionable stainless steel pocket clip in sort of a satin/polished finish. The hardware is bright stainless. The knife does have stainless steel liners. They are generously lightened with sort of rectangular holes, and I'm going to get to the liner process here in a minute too. The knife has what appears to be a stainless steel backspacer, which controls the width dimension at the front of the knife, as well as housing the mechanism for the cage ball lock. Now, before I get into what's really good about this knife, and there is a lot that's really good, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant. This knife retails for $164.95, and really since it came out, a pretty common price for the Manix 2XL has been right around $100, give or take. I don't remember exactly what I paid for buying. I think it was very close to $100. I'm going to make a point here and then I'm going to explain it. I would much rather have this knife for $125 and have it right than for $100 like it comes. And let's get into some pretty hefty criticisms of this knife. First of all, for a Golden, Colorado produced Spyderco knife, I expect one that works better. When this one came to me, it didn't have this sort of smooth actuation that you're witnessing on camera right now. It came to me very stiff, difficult to open, difficult to close, which would indicate an overly tight knife using regular logic, but it also came with a pretty fair amount of side-to-side blade play. And basically, that's a function of a couple things. Poor dimensional control, poor flatness, and in the case of this knife, extremely poor washers. I'm going to try to get this on camera so you can see it. This is one of the factory washers that came in the knife, and I don't know if I can get this to focus, but up close you can see that washer is shaped like a saucer. That's how it came in the knife. You'll also notice as I set the washer next to the pivot screw, can you see the proportions here? We've got a huge broad blade, a huge broad handle, and a tiny, tiny pivot washer. Frankly, completely inadequate to bear the side-to-side or lateral forces of a blade this size. I actually did contact Spyderco, and they did send me a new set of washers. Didn't make me send the knife in. They questioned the dealer I bought it from. Didn't know how it left the factory like that, but as you know, a knife that rides on phosphor bronze washers is kind of depending on them to be flat and smooth. And in this case, they just weren't. So I put the new washers in, and I really couldn't make the knife much better with the new washers. I just happened to have, let me see if I can compare for you. I happened to have a bag of a larger size washer. And you can see the size comparison between what was in the knife and what went in the knife. I used I believe a 3/8 outside diameter washer and perhaps 7/16. I think the ones that came in them were 3/8. Larger diameter. And then I had to go about fitting them. The whole diameter in my aftermarket washers was just a hair small. I had to ream them, and then I had to try to get the thickness exactly right so the knife would function. And if you understand Spyderco's bushing system, this backspacer, or in some knives the standoffs near the front of the knife, need to be of a precise thickness and a precise flatness to exactly replicate the length of the shouldered part of the pivot bushing and the thickness of the two washers. That makes the slabs of the knife sit flat and true, so as the blade rotates throughout its range of motion, the tension from the bearing surfaces in the knife remain consistent and the blade operates smoothly without binding or getting loose. And this knife was tight in spots as it rotated, and then as it opened it was very floppy. So I had to go through what's become a rather normal practice for me in a production knife. Took it all apart, sanded it on a surface plate to remove burrs and maximize flatness. I sanded and polished the washers until everything was true, put it back together, and after, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours of work, I ended up with the Manix 2 that should have been sent to me from the factory. A couple other complaints. The manufacturing process for the stainless steel liners is not what it needs to be. These are made out of pretty thin, probably 420 J2 stock. In order to simplify manufacturing, they've used a rather finished grade of stainless steel, and either by water jet or pretty good punch press, these things are stamped out or cut out in a finished state, which isn't a very finished state. There are lots of tool marks around the smooth areas of the liners, and this stuff that passes for jimping isn't cut in like normal jimping. It's kind of stamped out. The liners are very light, but they don't provide much strength. And they're not very flat, and they have lots of burrs as they come from the factory. That's a problem as far as I'm concerned. The other thing, and I don't know if this is going to be able to be seen or not, I'm going to try to show you. When I got this knife, I could see light between the backspacer and the liner on the right side, and even more light between the G10 scale and the liner on the right side. I don't know that that's showing up anymore. It's a lot better than it was after my rework. I noticed something as I was looking at pictures of other Manixes, specifically Manix 2s in the normal length. Those knives have another screw right here, forward of the caged ball lock. The stop pin, well, I guess not the stop pin, but the assembly pin for this backspacer on the smaller knife is a screw like this one. In the XL, it's just a pin through the backspacer into the liners. There is no screw holding the front of the knife together. And on my particular knife, it wasn't together, which is another problem. So what I ended up with was a loose, floppy, tight, poorly actuating $100 Spyderco. Not cool. Another thing that I noticed about this knife that I really didn't like, and you can see this on camera, the satin finish on the blade is very blotchy. It's just not good. And let's get to the final gripe before we get to the good stuff in part 2. The edge on my knife as it came from the factory was atrocious. It was terribly asymmetrical. The tip showed evidence that it was probably burned a little bit, and it was adequately sharp, but it couldn't really make up its mind if it wanted to be a V grind or a chisel grind, and it wasn't consistent down the length of the blade on either side. Just not good. Like I said, I would much rather have paid $25, $30, $40 more for this knife and had it be right. See you in part 2, and we'll get to the good stuff.